in the MDPCP Advisory Council meeting scheduled this evening to run from 5 to 6:30. In attendance today, we have Doctors Reedman, Pham, Okiki, Berenson, and Rose. We also have, and Dr. Haft. We have Gene Ransom in attendance, and we have Kathy Chapman. Did I miss anyone on the advisory council? And Kevin Hayes, my apologies. Did I miss anyone on the advisory council that I haven't announced during this start of the call? Okay. So as we generally do, we begin with some operation announcements. Melanie, my colleague, if you wouldn't mind making those remarks.
Okay. Thank you, David. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone. Just want to remind you that the meeting is being recorded. In the event the meeting is hacked, please hang up immediately, and then I will send you an email with a new meeting login then that you can log into, and then the meeting recording will be available to the public. Please contact Anena or myself, or send a chat if you're having any technical issues. As we've said, you can mute and unmute yourself using the small button at the bottom of your screen that looks like a microphone. Please remain on mute when you're not speaking to reduce background noise. Staff may mute you, but you are always able to unmute yourself. You can use the chat function to send notes to all attendees. However, as we've mentioned, you can't send a chat message to a specific attendee with this technology. Please announce yourself when speaking. So everyone's free to speak throughout the meeting. Since there are a lot of people, we do try to sequence the speakers when possible. So the method we usually use is to hold something up, and the facilitator, which is David, Dr. Sharp, will call on you. And you can also put a message into the chat, and we can call on you that way. So I think that's all I have. Oh, the last one is to make sure that we can see you on camera. So see your paper on camera when you hold it up, because sometimes people hold it over here. I'm holding it up, but we can't see it. So that's all. Back to you,
Okay.
David.
Thank you. And joining us, we've had Dr. Barr and our Executive Director, Ben Steffen. So with that, I would invite Dr. Haft to provide the PMO update.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you all for joining again on a Tuesday evening, and as we continue through this pandemic. And I know we're competing with the governor's press conference tonight, but I'm sure that information will be readily available as soon as we finish this evening also. But I just wanted to bring you up to date and refresh on where we've been and where we're going in these waning weeks of 2020 in regard to Track 3 proposal for CMMI for MDPCP. So we've done a great deal of work and had a great deal of information presented, and very, very generous and thoughtful conversation over many of the aspects of this program. Just to reframe, I think we've agreed, because we've been largely instructed that the model that we'll be using going forward in Track 3 will be a model that is formed in the essential elements of primary care first. So we have a population-based payment, flat fee. Those together are included as a total primary care payment, and then a performance adjustment. Tonight we'll be looking at some more information in terms of what payment, again, adjustments might be made, but CMMI has now asked us again to make a bit of a pivot in our thinking and in the information we present to them. You recall we started by presenting back a list of comments from various members that were then consolidated and provided related to various elements of the RFA. We then pivoted to actually editing an RFA with the notion that that would be the controlling document that would be handed over at the end of the year to CMMI. In our the most recent discussions, our colleagues at CMI have suggested that really what they would be most helpful for them in terms of the subsequent process as they move through the federal clearance process known as the ISIP process would be to have perhaps a 10 or so page policy document speaking to each of these cardinal elements, some of which we'll cover tonight, in the formation of this track 3. And those cardinal elements, again, will be basically fundamental questions about how we want to finance this program. Do we want it to be financed to be about equivalent to what fee-for-service for participants would be? Do we want it to be equivalent to what the current track 2 payments are? Or do we want it knowing that it's going to be exposed to a performance adjustment and some risk? Do we want it to be somewhat higher than what track 2 is? And if so, how would we configure that? We'll have to settle again on whether we are strongly leaning toward a method that takes an average HCC score or a method that we describe as money follows the patient, sort of the beneficiary model. And we'll have to talk about how we want to adjust those payments, those large payments that consolidate what previously was fee-for-service largely in our MDPCP program, consolidating it into what would be a combination of a flat fee-for-service like payment and population-based payment. And then under that construct, how much we want to move toward population-based payments and how much away from fee-for-service, how much we want to diminish the flat fee and inflate the population-based payment. So we've had discussions about all of those pieces over the last several months on weekly Tuesday evenings. I think we're now getting to the point where we're going to have to settle into these decisions and carve them into more policy payments. Also know that as we're making these statements, even on the other side of the table, CMS is going through we'll be going through a transition as we I think all paid attention over the last several weeks. There was an election. There'll be a transition to a new administration, new leadership, and that may color some of the decision making in terms of some of these elements and the influences on some of these elements as they go through that clearance process. I think I would like to say at this point that every indication we've got from the current administration is a strong encouragement to make more investments in primary care. That there's been a strong belief in all the models to make investments in primary care. Clearly, even fee-for-service is moving toward more primary care investments with the current administration. And every indication we have is that the incoming administration will be even more bullish about that. So as much as we can align with what we see the current indications are and what the future indications are, moving from fee-for-service to population payments, moving to primary care investments, and simplifying programs. I think those will probably be a good guidepost for us for the future. So I'll just stop there because we do have some really important analyses that our great colleagues at H-Metrics have made, and I think they will help inform us in our decision making this evening. And I'll stop there to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Haft. And for the record, joining us is Will Daniel. Good afternoon, Will. Dr. Riedman, any remarks before we continue onward?
No, I just want to make one comment about we've had a couple discussions about the H-Metrics presentations, and I'd like to finish that up in a fairly efficient method this afternoon with the presentation, and then I'd really like to get some firm recommendations or some conclusions on the two items that are related to that today, which are basically the money follows the patient and exactly where we should make a recommendation about the payments, the fee-for-service payments, and the performance-based payments. So I'd really like to get through that today and get some more firm commitment with the committee about recommendations so we can move on to some of the other options. We've got a limited number of meetings before the end of the year, somewhere between 4 to 5, depending on holidays and stuff. So I'd like to get through most of that tonight. So I'll, in the interest of time, let Audrey go ahead and give her presentation. I'll throw it back to you for a second, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Reedman. Ben, any comment, or are we safe to?
No, I just heard Dr. Reedman give us a marching order, so let's start.
Understood. Audrey.
Wonderful. Then let's get started. So I know this presentation, I think, was sent over to everybody in advance. So there's a lot of numbers and a lot of detail in here, but we can keep it at a high level just to really highlight the key points. The purpose of this presentation tonight is to follow up on some of the follow-up items that were discussed in previous weeks. So we have some sensitivity analyses of what would happen if we change the population-based payments. But most importantly, we are now taking the flat fee payments that we've talked about in past meetings and kind of actually baked it into the model, as opposed to talking about it as a secondary option. So to get started on the next slide, there's 3 analyses. I think we're actually just going to start with the first 2, and then David, we can get back to performance-based adjustments as time allows later on in the agenda.
Okay.
So we're going to cover the impact on total primary care payment when we use a flat fee based on 99212, which is a deviation from the results that you've seen previously, and as well as kind of a sensitivity analyses where we handle our complex patients or those beneficiaries with behavioral health or substance abuse disorders. We have an auto assignment for them. So on the next slide, we'll start with total primary care payment using a 99212 flat fee. And on the next slide, so this is, let's get you grounded a little bit. The top panel are results that you've seen for several weeks now. That is using a model where we have a flat fee that uses all E&M services. It's the weighted average payment for all E&M services included in the flat fee, which we have pegged at $96 plus beneficiary cost sharing. That original model overall has a program impact of reducing payments under Track 3 by 11.4% relative to Track 2 payments, so under current payments under Track 2. If we were to keep the PBP payments the same, this is the practice group model. So just to remind everybody, this is putting a practice into a single group based on their average HCC score of all of their attributed beneficiaries. If we keep the population-based payment the same and only adjust the flat fee to be in line with PCF, which is 99212, we see significant reductions in total payment. So the 99212 weighted average payment after we adjust for multiple E&Ms per claim and gypsy adjustment and all of that, we have a $62 flat fee, of which beneficiary cost sharing would be added to that as well. So our total impact here is a negative 23.8%. So Track 3 total payments, the PBP annual payments plus the flat fee, would be 23% lower than they would be than the current Track 2 payments. On the next slide, we have a provider impact or a practice group impact. And you can effectively see that you have 2 columns of data there. You have the original practice group, which was the 11.4% model, the revised practice group, which is about negative 24%. And overall, there's an 11 to 13 percentage point difference at the practice level when we look at our distributions by percentile. So you can see the orange line there reflecting our newest model, the practice group model with the flat fee of 99212, has significantly lower payments across all practices, with just the maximum providers kind of breaking even or having higher payments under Track 3. On the next slide, we can turn to the beneficiary model, which I think directionally is where the Advisory Council has been leaning towards. This is the money follows the person model. In our original model, these are the results that you've seen all along, where we have an 11% increase in total payments under Track 3 using this model. So again, each beneficiary is placed into a practice group. It's actually a beneficiary group here. Each beneficiary is placed into a group based on their HCC score, and then the practice will receive the beneficiary-specific PBP payment based on that HCC score and based on that group. So using the $96 flat fee plus the beneficiary cost sharing, we had an 11% increase in payment. When we reduced that flat fee down to 62%, the model is close to breaking even to what the current Track 2 payments are. So I want to make sure I'm clear on this, is that the Track 3 payments, the population-based payments annually, plus the E&M payments using the flat fee, in total will be about the same, negative 1.4% different, to what practices currently receive under Track 2 in aggregate, including the CMF payments plus the E&M services. Now, on the next slide, of course, the overall model is budget neutral in some respects, but there's certainly wide impacts across practices. And you can see on the chart on the right, when you look at the orange, you do have the 50th percentile of practices. 50th percentile is about break even. You do have a nice kind of even distribution. It's quite symmetrical, where you have the max and the min having, let's see, the minimum impact being negative 29%, the maximum impact being a positive 31%. So it's a fairly even distribution across all the practices under this model. All right, any questions on that before I turn to sensitivity analyses?
Dr. Berenson. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Dr. Berenson.
Just want to clarify, $62 is 2018 99212 and not 2021.
No, it's 2021.
It is 2021. Okay.
Yep. So we took the 20. So let's back this up. So we the primary care first model had the $40.82, which was based on 2018. Right. We have inflated that to be $2021 using the national fee schedule. And we apply an adjustment to account for multiple E&Ms being on a single claim. Once we factor in Maryland Gypsy adjustment and all of that, we have $62 flat fee. And then you have the beneficiary cost sharing of 20% of each E&M service that is billed at the national fee schedule amount.
And the $96 was the weighted average of the E&M?
It was a weighted average of all 39 E&M codes that are included in the flat fee. So that was the original model. We originally talked about it as being like $132, which is in essence the total amount of the payment that the practices would receive on average once factoring in all of their E&Ms. But it's a $96 flat fee plus the beneficiary cost sharing. And
just my final question, if we just use the E&M that were the office visits, like 99211 to 5, that would be somewhere between 62 and 96?
Yeah, it was slightly higher than the 62. If I recall, I think the total was not, instead of the 96, I think it was closer to a $92 flat fee. So it was much higher to the original model than the revised. It was $92 flat fee plus beneficiary cost sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Audrey, in those first three columns on the left-hand side, do you know what the N number is? How many practices that is?
Sure. This is 122 practices. So these are only our Track 2 practices for 2021 based on Q3 attribution. Excuse me. So it's 122. You have about 12 practices per decile there.
So this is only the current Track 2 practices. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions at this point?
So it's not a question, David, so much as just to make sure we understand that this is what this range of payments here is the range relative to what the Track 2 payments are. This is before any performance adjustment. This is just saying a practice, if you previously got paid X amount, irrespective of any performance adjustment or PBIP, here's where you would be with this model in comparison. So this is, again, before any this is not a performance adjustment range, it's a pre-performance adjustment range.
And hey, Audrey, so before we move on, then, so I'm clear also, so this is all based on current fee for service payments or track 2 payments. Does that include the care management fees?
Yes. So if we can actually go back one slide, I think we can spell that out a little better. So on the track 2 payment side, being the current base of which we're comparing this to, these are the care management fees,
Okay.
plus the E&M services billed at fee for service.
Gotcha.
And then our modeled payment will be our population-based payment, which are PCF-like, plus the flat fee, producing the total payments on the modeled side. So we are very apples to apples in that it is the same E&M services on both sides of the equation. Beneficiary cost sharing is included in both, and they both include their own type of care management fee, whether it be CMF or PBP.
Kevin.
What happens to the chronic care management codes? They are not going to be billable under track 3, right? But they are billable under track 2.
So we have excluded them since they are not billable. They are excluded from the flat fee, so they are not included in this analysis. They would not be included on either side of the analysis because it is the they're excluded from both sides because we're using the same set of E&M codes to keep it an even playing field.
Okay, thank you.
And Mel, did Kathy Chapman have a point to raise?
So the one from the chat, David.
Yes.
So I'm sorry, I can't. CCM's not billable for under the MDPCP, which was, I think, the point that Audrey was saying, right? Isn't that what you were saying, Audrey?
Yeah, so it's not billable in either scenario, so we have it excluded from both sides.
Okay. All right. Any other questions before we continue on? Okay, Audrey.
All right, so let's go to slide 8, please. So we did a sensitivity analysis where we wanted to understand what impact it would have if what impact an increase in PBP payment would have. Just how sensitive is this model? So I'm actually going to focus on the right side, I think, since beneficiary group model is where we've tended to resonate. So what we've looked at is the first column there is your PCF payment rates for each group. Those are your inputs. That's what the current PCF policy is, and that's what we've modeled to date. We then provide 3 sensitivities. The first being, what would the total impact be if the PCF population-based payments were increased by 5%? Of course, rounded out to make nice, clean numbers. What would happen if those PBP payments were increased by 10%? And then last, what would those PBP payments need to be in order to make the track 2 payments overall, total payments, PBP plus E&M, equal what it is in track 2? So to even out the model, so track 3 equals track 2 payments. So your inputs are on that top panel just so you can see what the input assumptions are. And our results are at the bottom panel. So the negative 1.4% is what I just walked you through. That is our base model. An increase of PCF of 5% kind of flips the model, makes it positive. Track 3 payments would be 2.5% higher than track 2. At 10%, track 3 total payments would be 6.6% higher than track 2. And you'll see that there is a big variation in the individual groups, though. So you still have groups 1 and groups 2 having lower payments under track 3 than under track 2, with groups 3 and 4 having significantly higher payments under track 3 relative to track 2. The driver of that, which we're actually going to talk about in just a slide or two, is likely your complex beneficiaries. So those beneficiaries with a behavioral health or a substance abuse diagnosis that is being placed in those groups based on their HCC score. I think that's what's really driving a lot of those big losses in those groups 1 and 2. Our last column is saying, okay, let's fix the system. Let's make sure that every group ends up with track 3 payments equal to track 2 payments.
I'm sorry, Audrey,
yep.
Can I just ask for a clarification on that last point? So you're saying that that having the beneficiaries in their panels, they're being underpriced
So
I didn't
the
follow
way,
the last point.
sure, the way this model works is that a beneficiary gets placed into the group based on their HCC score with no other criteria. And we know that under track 2, there is an auto assignment of beneficiaries that if you have a diagnosis of dementia, for example, regardless of your HCC score, you are placed into the complex tier and you have that much higher payment rate associated with you.
Okay, so this is about overpricing.
This would be, yes, this would be an
Okay.
issue of overpricing because the track 3 payment is $30 under our PCF plus 5 model. But under the current policy under track 2, they're getting that complex payment of over $100 for that same beneficiary.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so just the last column, I was just going to round it out of what if we fix the system and say that every group total payments for track 3 need to equal total payments for track 2. What would the PCF population-based payment need to be? And you'll see those, that's the 37, 63, 72, and 112. You know, slight increase for groups 1 and groups 2, but fairly significant decreases for groups 3 and 4 relative to the PCF payment groups. Okay, so I think this was just kind of an exercise to understand how sensitive the model is. So what change, we could, of course, plug in any number we want for our groups, but I hope this gives you a sense of kind of the sensitivity of the model and what inputs we could use to get desired results. All right, in the next section, we're going to talk about auto assignment, and I think after we go through these few slides, we'll jump back to the agenda and talk policy discussions. Of course, I'll answer any questions that you have. So we noticed in doing the beneficiary group model that a lot of the results were driven by the impact of the complex population. So there's a large number of beneficiaries that are deemed complex under current track 2, in that they have a behavioral health diagnosis or they have a substance abuse condition. And regardless of their HCC score, they're then put into the complex tier under track 2. Under our original beneficiary group model, we were completely agnostic to the diagnosis of the beneficiary and said, what is your HCC score? And go into the corresponding HCC score, go into the corresponding PCF group based on that score. We then said, what if we do an auto assignment, similar to the way the auto assignment works in track 2? So if you have a diagnosis of, it's the same diagnoses, if you have behavioral health or substance abuse diagnoses, automatically, regardless of your HCC score, we place you into group 4, and your practice will receive the population-based payment associated with group 4 for you. As expected, it has a considerable impact on our model here. But before we go through the dollars, I want to draw your attention to the number of beneficiaries. So your first panel is the results that you saw a few minutes ago. It's our beneficiary group model that has an overall impact of negative 1.4%. You have 77,000 beneficiaries in group 1. But once we look at these beneficiaries with behavioral health or substance abuse, we find that 14,000 or so of them should actually be going into group 4 because they have a condition that would, they're currently complex. So they have a condition that would put them into group 4 auto assignment. So if you look at our group 4 distribution, we had 8,000 beneficiaries, 8,163 beneficiaries in this model on the top tier group 4 beneficiaries. And after we complete our auto assignment, we have 26,000 beneficiaries in group 4. Just due to the much higher payment in group 4, this model has significant impact. It has almost a 33% impact in total spending, total payments, PBP plus E&M, when you have your auto assignment of beneficiaries into group 4. So what's interesting here is what's driving the model is not the increase in PBP payments as much. It's actually, a lot of it is the decrease in the track 2 payments. It's the distribution of beneficiaries. So you'll see in group 1 on the top panel, we have group 1 having a percent impact of negative 14%. Once we take out those complex beneficiaries that were receiving much higher CMF payments and put them into our group 4, our group 1 impact flips to be positive. It flips to have a 17% increase in payments under track 3 to track 2. So I think this just helps kind of understand the impact of the auto assignment of your complex beneficiaries if this is a policy decision that the council wants to consider. Again, it's using the HCC tiers to put beneficiaries into the appropriate group, but maintaining that complex auto assignment that's consistent with track 2. I think we just provide, on the next slide, we provide a practice impact. So the blue, looking at the right side, the blue lines were consistent with what you saw a few slides ago. We just overlay the orange, which is the impact for providers, favorable across the board. Everybody's a winner. It ranges from a 10% increase to an 80% increase at the practice level. Again, all of this is before performance-based adjustments. And then on the last slide, we have our sensitivity analyses the same way we've done it in the previous slides, where but instead of doing increases in PCF, because our payments are already significantly higher than track 2, we switched it around and said, what if we decrease PCF payments by 5% and by 10%? And what if we align them so that we ensure that the overall model with auto assignment for track 3 has consistent payment amounts in total to track 2. So but looking at the -5 and the -10% model, the impact is somewhat expected. We go from a 32% increase in payment down to 27% when we do -5 and 22% when we do -10. But I think most interestingly is the model that aligns track 2 payments with track 3. You have relatively minor changes when you look at group 1 and 2. Instead of a $28 PCF, it's a $20 PCF for group 1. For group 2, instead of $45, it's $43. But you really feel the impact when you look at groups 3 and 4, where it goes from $100 under PCF, it would be $55 in order to align payments. And instead of $175 for group 4, it would be $110. Okay, so I think that is that's a quick run through of what I just wanted to follow up with. I know some of those questions came up in past meetings. I know there's a ton of information here, so welcome anybody to ask questions now, or if you review these on your own later and have any follow-up, we're happy to address any questions that you may have.
So here's a good place to start. So any questions from the council on the slides we've just seen? Dr. Berenson.
Yeah, I do not know this since I don't know track 2 very well, but how selective are the behavioral health diagnoses? Are they any behavioral health diagnosis, or are they some subset of ICD-10 codes? Does it include cognitive deficits as behavioral health? I mean, it seems to be a pretty large universe, and I'm just wondering if the diagnoses are not very selective.
Bob, it's a great question, and they are somewhat selective. So there any substance use disorder, behavioral health code that's pervasive. So there was an analysis done by a group internal to CMMI to pick out the pervasive codes, and we can provide those codes to you. I don't have them handy, but we'll send them to you and post them here also. But
the goal of pervasive is to not include somebody with a sleep disorder who just needs some anti-anxiety medication or something. It's trying to get at people who have ongoing needs for interaction with.
Yeah, and I think it was intended to reflect what the experience on the ground is, that people with substance use disorder and also with pervasive behavioral health conditions are more expensive and more frequent users of the hospital and emergency department that may not be reflected because of the acuteness of their conditions and their HCC scores. I think it's been reflected also in, I think RAND did a recent study on the impact on healthcare spending for people with substance use disorders and behavioral health. So it was responsive to that, and kudos to Will Daniel, who is here in the committee, and the council, who was instrumental in that.
Okay, now that answers my question. Thank you.
Dr. Tom.
Yeah, I guess I had a related question, which is, it sounds like it was a pretty rational decision to try using that auto assignment method back before CMS had developed an HCC method specifically targeting high cost, high need subpopulations. Now that they have that new methodology, what is our rationale for sticking to this one? I mean, if you had told me that the original rationale was really about how much time a clinician needs to spend with people with these pervasive codes, I think that would be a somewhat different argument. But if the original rationale really was to try to find a correlate to eventual utilization and cost, the agency has now developed that methodology. They feel good enough about it to put it in direct contracting, in direct contracting and for ESRD and the high needs track in direct contracting. So I'm just wondering.
So Dr.
Are we analyzing the right option?
I think we're just looking at what, in this modeling, what our historical option or in our current option is now, to see how we model around that. I think if there was if we incorporate, as you said, a code that already reflected this, it would obviate the need to do that. We'd have to. We don't have that. I don't think we have that information or those codes. We'd have to do a little bit more work to see how it impacted it.
Understood. I just wasn't sure if we were open to doing that. Howard?
I think we are. And to your very good point, and to refocus what the purpose here is this is just giving us an idea of the various different ways in which we could model. But the ultimate goal is what we have to get to is what is the end? Are we looking to do something that is fee-for-service equivalent, track 2 equivalent, or something that is a lagniappe a little bit more than what we get in track 2 because of the greater amount of revenue that's exposed to risk. I think that's we'll have, I believe, an opportunity over the next 6 months or a year to refine those numbers to get to what the policy goal is.
Okay. Any other questions before we travel? Kathy.
I have a question on the E&M amount. Currently, the E&M codes, docs get 80% of that, 213, 214 fee. Nurse practitioners get 85% of what docs do. So the amount of money that is used for the EM code, is that going to be also tiered, lowered for 80% for docs, and then again for nurse practitioners?
That's an interesting question. There's nothing that I saw in the PCF technical methodology that indicates that. So what's actually different about PCF for this flat fee is that Medicare pays 100% of the PCF. So the beneficiary cost sharing is not happening on the flat fee. The Medicare is responsible for 100% of that amount, and then the beneficiary cost sharing comes in at based on each individual E&M code based on the national fee schedule. So I actually, Howard or Dr. Hafty, are you aware of any impact for nurse practitioners during physicians? Because I didn't see anything on that, but we also didn't model it that way. So
and I think having looked at it, I think it was silent to any additional adjustment for nurse practitioners or PAs. So my assumption is, unless there's some additional information there that we're not privy to, there was a second volume in terms of the financial payment methodology, but that's not been made available to us. So if something's in there that speaks to that, it may change that, but in the current material, there's no difference between those payments for the flat fee.
Okay. Any other questions at the moment? Okay. Alana, why don't you bring up the agenda again? Let's look at the policy questions. So we're at a point where we'd like to open it up for discussion. If we look to the first section on policy questions on track 3 payment goals, there are 3 approaches that we've listed here. I imagine there could be others, but what we'd like to do is get your feedback. What do you think is the most important approach to consider and why? And why do you think the others might not be significant? So we're not necessarily looking for consensus overall, but we'd like to get a good sense of how you as advisory council members feel about these particular approach here that we've listed, or any other approach that comes to mind. So let me give you a moment just to think about that, and then we'll start asking folks for their thoughts.
So to preface that also a little further, David, I think that the numbers we have presented by Audrey and H-Metrics have been excellent. I think they really help us to focus our discussion. And I think as Howard just mentioned, I'd like to take the rest of this time to come up with some policy and some recommendations in the broader picture. And then we have time once we get these basic policy issues settled in to settle out where there should be the 62 or the 93 or the whatever the number should happen to be. I'd really like to look at the big picture of where we should be with this. I think that there's also a comment made earlier about that, and I've heard this comment for years now, that the whole purpose of the population health is to decrease total cost of care and basically make an investment in primary care. And if we're going to make an investment in primary care, I would argue that if we're making an investment, it needs to be a real investment. The primary care physicians are being asked to take on more responsibility. When we talk about these fees, these are not compensation for providers. There's a lot of care management fees, a lot of additional work, a lot of additional employee expenses, and services need to be required to supported on these patients. So I think if we're going to make a true investment, anything that cuts primary care fees from what they are now or puts them at significantly higher risk for doing more work, I think is going to be a setup for failure. I think that my own opinion as a clinician that whatever we come up with, the basic fee needs to be close to or at what we're getting right now with track 2. And then the incentive should be that extra payment for truly help in increasing the total cost of care. But if there is a program that is going to ultimately significantly put a number of primary care providers at risk, or significantly reduce some of their incomes and potentially even increase others, but potentially decrease some, I think it's going to be a setup for failure. So my argument would be that we truly make an investment in primary care, that we more appropriately reimburse primary care for the services they've been doing over the years, and then the additional bonus money would be that's what's at risk, and that's where we play with a little bit more. But I think we should be cautious about decreasing primary care fees, putting them at risk from where they are now.
So, Dr. Riedman, are you making a suggestion that we focus more on providing additional funds over track 2 as sort of a?
Yeah. So taking off my my committee chairman hat, which is unbiased, and put on my physician hat, which is actually a hat that I can switch. I definitely, yes, I think that those would be my recommendations as a primary care physician and a primary care provider that looking from the primary care standpoint. So yes, and then I obviously open it up to the floor for further conversation and y'all's feedback.
Okay, so Gene, and then we'll go to some of our physician colleagues here on the call.
I agree with everything Dr. Riedman just said 100%, and I'm going to go through each one of them and explain why. The first is, I think roughly equivalent to fee-for-service is a total non-starter. That just means you're going to blow the program up. Why and how could we ask primary care practitioners to accept the same payment to do all this extra work? It just doesn't make any sense. And we have to remember that the doctors are taking risk every day by participating in the program, because when they're spending time on this, it's time they can't do work and bill for. So when people say there's not enough risk, they're not taking into consideration the risk is the doctor's time. And I think the first one is just not a good idea. It's not reasonable, and we should just take it off the table right now. I prefer giving additional funds, because we're asking folks to do more in track 3, and we should pay them to do more in track 3. This is an investment in primary care. I think that's what this was meant to be, and that's where it should be. And I have a strong opinion on that. I think that if you talk to all the physicians in the program, they would agree that they're just not reasonable. And I'm adamantly opposed to the first one.
Thank you, Gene. So let's ask our physicians. Dr. Pham, what are your thoughts?
So I won't repeat all the arguments that have been made, because I completely agree with them both. But I would also point out that, I think once upon a time we had gotten signals from CMS that it was very important that we hew to the primary care first methodology. But it seems like, based on recent anecdotal information, that the interest in participation for that program is below underwhelming, at least as of the end of last month. Maybe there will be a rush of LOIs this month, during an election season, but at the pace that they were going to end up with fewer practices than participated in CPC Classic. And so I think that if we're chasing that cart, we may be setting ourselves up for a similar level of disillusionment, which I don't, I think the state has just invested so much in this effort, not just the primary care program, but the overall waiver and all of the related initiatives. I just see there's no tailwind anymore. Once upon a time, we felt like there was a tailwind, right? Where we had to at least take a hard look at that option. And I just don't see the rationale for it there anymore.
Thank you. Dr. Barr?
It's always hard finding that red button. Nothing really to add to the comments previously. I completely support what Gene and Michael said, and what my fam said about the additional funds over track 2. I really appreciate the analysis. There's no reason to, this is a lot to ask of the practices, and anything less than additional funds would not get the traction.
Yeah, okay. Dr. Okiki?
If you can hear me, I don't have any comments at this time. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Dr. Berenson?
So I agree completely. I think Dr. Riedman laid it out very well. My own view is that, one additional factor that I would throw in there is, as Kevin Hayes would also, I think, agree to, because MedPAC has made this the major point, is that chronically Medicare has underpaid primary care, even within the parameters of a resource-based relative value scale. Systematic distortions in payment levels have gone to specialists of various kinds at the expense of cognitive physicians, many of whom are primary care physicians. So the increase that will happen in 2021 is a partial redress of those chronic distortions, but not enough. And I agree with the argument that there's new responsibilities here that should be accounted for. Even before sort of chronic care management responsibilities, there was a number of studies showing that about 25 to 30% of a primary care physician's day is not paid for. There's all the pharmacy renewals, all of the conversations with home health agencies and other physicians, and the whole range of activities are not compensated. And moving to a PMPM is one way to compensate it, but requires more money to do that work. Having said all of that, so I would be for a generous increase in additional funds and take that partly out of the performance bonuses, because as Michael Barr knows, I think we do not have pay for performance right yet. And when we had a discussion of the potential bonuses and penalties, I think they were entirely too great a swing between the winners and the losers. So I would reduce the reliance on performance bonuses, put it into the fact that primary care practices have clearly more work to do, and try to learn from pay for performance over time, but be less ambitious with it at the front end.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And the performance-based adjustments will come up either later tonight or at the next meeting. So Dr. Berkowitz, can you weigh in?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes, I agree with the comments that have been stated. I think it needs, and I feel strongly as well, it needs to be at least as significant as track 2 in order to justify the efforts and to at least sustain and increase the ongoing activities.
Okay, thank you. A couple more physicians. Dr. Rose, any comments?
No comments from me.
And Kathy Chapman, anything additional to add?
No, I agree with all the comments that have been made.
So let's turn to a couple of other advisory council members. Let's get the perspective from Debbie Kuchka-Craig.
Yeah, I hear everyone's comments. I guess the only thing I would add is we really, for the sake of the model, then need to believe in the program and that the investment with additional funds will be able to bend the curve. That's my only concern. I did have a question about the analysis based on the track 2 practices. Audrey, can you remind me, you had mentioned how many are in there. Would we expect, as practices transition from track 1 to track 2, that their experience would be quite similar? I'm just a little, we're basing so much on the current track 2 practices, and as I recall, they're a fraction of what we have in the program today, right? It's the minority group because we still have the majority in track 1. Would we expect the same analysis? Would you expect the same kind of profile as the track 1 practices come in? Is that a risk that we're, only looking at this selection of current track 2?
Well, would you be able, I guess I have a broader policy question, would you be able to get to track 3 without going through track 2 first?
Dr. Haft may want to weigh in on that.
Very good question. I think that the answer is, at least preliminarily, is that if a practice met all of the requirements that are substantially in the RFA for primary care first, they would be able to either come from de novo, from outside of MDPCP, or from any level and join. So the one requirement that is there that might be of consideration was having some experience in a performance-based program. So track 1 practices do have some experience. They don't have the same experience as a track 2 with the comprehensive primary care payments, but they do have some experience. So that would be a matter of, I think, of further refinement in that policy decision. But likely they would be able to. I want to point out, though, that our current thinking, track 1 is going to phase out. So practices will all be required to move from track 1 to track 2, as they are now over 3 years. We would move in the subsequent RFA to make that happen in 2 years, and then subsequently phase it out. So effectively, by the start of this program, there wouldn't be any more track 1 practices, or there wouldn't be any new track 1 practices.
Okay. Jean, I believe that answered your question as well. If not, please jump in here. So Kevin, and then Ben. Kevin, then Ben.
Yes. Let me first just follow up on a point that Dr. Berenson made about what we might think of as the kind of chronic underpayments for primary care. If we contrast primary care with other services, you know, where we're talking about procedures and imaging and tests and so forth, there's abundant opportunities with those services for efficiency gains that come about through improvements in technology and other advances. Whereas with primary care, it's much more difficult to achieve those efficiencies just because of we're talking about services that require, most importantly, just the investment of time on the part of the clinician with the patient. So there's just been a systematic kind of chronic, over the course of now close to 30 years of underpayment for these kinds of services. So this does argue clearly for some kind of additional funds for primary care. The only other point I would make otherwise is that, you know, as we compare, you know, the research that's been done comparing the states and their kind of mix of primary care services versus specialty services, it's pretty clear that the more primary care oriented systems, states are much more efficient, have better outcomes and so forth than do the states that are tilted more in the direction of specialty care. So all of this argues, you know, I think very strongly for making an additional investment in primary care.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Ben, and then Will Daniels.
Yeah, I think, you know, I want to kick our staff for why we put in making them equivalent to fee-for-service. I don't think we seriously, that may have been a straw man, but I think the real debate is between equivalent to track 2 payments or more. And our rule of thumb has been that track 2 is about 20 to 25% above conventional fee-for-service. And I think it probably is not precise, but a general metric we could use to think about this as we're trying to get some broad policy directions here. Is that sufficient, or does it need to be escalated given the additional risk and the additional work that would be anticipated in the third track? It just occurred to me, Audrey, on the E&M services for track 2, did we adjust those to 2021 levels when we made our comparisons? So did they represent the 2021 fee levels for those codes, or do they represent the 2021 inflated levels from the 2020?
No, we repriced all of the E&Ms on the 2021 proposed fee schedule.
So it's really absolutely comparable, and inflation adjustments were appropriately applied. Okay, thanks.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
So,
okay, go ahead.
Will, are you able to make a comment here?
Yes. However, I do not have one.
Okay. So I think we've covered the gamut. It seems like if I were to try to summarize the tone for the policy discussion is that there's a strong desire to have additional funds over track 2 for primary care practices in this program. I think few would disagree with that. I think there's an interesting observation that Debbie made and regarding, you know, we really have to believe in this program if we're going to go that route. So let me pause for a moment and invite Dr. Pham to make a comment.
Yeah, and I thank you. It's in response to Debbie's comment, which I completely understand what's driving the concern. But I do want to caution us that I don't think it's a given that if we want to demonstrate the value of this program, that we have to ask the primary care program itself to pay for itself directly, right? We want the model in Maryland as a whole to be successful. There are other levers to pull in addition to what happens in the primary care program. in concert with the investment in primary care. There are other pricing levels that the state has discretion over. And so I just don't want us to fall into the trap of making the assumption that because we're making a commitment to increase investment in primary care, that we expect primary care to pay for that investment penny for penny. Because that is not how systemic change works, especially in a complex care delivery system that may take years to reorient itself. If you want quick results, there are other levers, including other pricing levers that the state can pull.
And I appreciate that comment very much. I think, unfortunately, though, we have a situation right now where, you know, year one of this MDPCP was expected to produce results before we were even up and running. So I get that. I'm not sure that everybody who's making policies in the state gets that, but excellent point.
Okay, thank you for that. I would also suggest that while it may not be an agenda item for today, and maybe the PMO doesn't need input from the advisory council on this, but a real challenge is going to be is where is that bar? And because it's tricky if you think about it, and that there isn't anyone that would say that primary care providers should not, in this program, should not get funds or significant funds. Some of the characterization has been. The question we have to eventually get to, whether it's this group or the PMO or it's left to CMMI, is what is that bar? And you know, we should start to think about that a little bit, because you know, it needs to be adequate. But there also is probably a ceiling on reasonableness that we may end up figuring out what it looks like at some point. So before we travel on, could I invite Dr. Haft to help sort of give us a sense of how this would work next and a policy statement from the Advisory Council?
Yeah, so I think this is great input and clearly very clear directionally in terms of the payments and the rationale behind the payments being somewhat higher than track 2. I think next we could move on to within that total population payment. Audrey and H-Metrics and this group have discussed two broad constructs. One was the look at inflating that flat fee to make the face-to-face visits more heavily weighted, and then thereby reducing the proportion of population-based payments. And then, based on discussions last week, there was a clear movement to an incentive and a notion that why would we want to inflate those flat fees that are face-to-face visits and harken back to fee-for-service when we want the entire model to move progressively toward population-based payments. So Audrey has gone back and done those sensitivity analyses using the lower rate, the $62 plus the cost sharing portion. So we've we have two different models to look at now. One says, you know, given the fact that we may say, you know, by policy we're looking at some increase over track 2. How do we want to make that increase? Do we want to make it more in the population-based portion or more in the flat fee portion? So if we have a discussion about that, since we've got a look at some of those models. And I would say disregard the exact numbers now, and we'll look to some way to flatten those curves so it doesn't disadvantage any one practice or greatly advantage any other practices. That's just simple mathematical equations. We could do some policy decisions, as Dr. Pham has suggested, in terms of how to use some more updated HCC scores, but the numbers themselves are infinitely adjustable. It's the policy that we need to settle on. And this is, I think, the next big policy pieces. Do we want to lean more heavily toward population-based, or do we want to try and, really inflate those flat fees. So can we have perhaps a discussion about that? I think that would be very helpful in moving this ball down the field.
Dr. Haft, this is Dr. Okeke. Just real quick, to add to that, is there a need to keep our eyes on the bigger price, which is how much investments are we making in primary care now and throughout the duration that we're planning this policy for? Would that also be something to include, sooner rather than later?
So do you mean in terms of the absolute amount of investment over time?
Yeah.
Or?
In terms of the percent primary care spend, so that way it kind of keeps us in a reasonable, would I say, total that we can keep working with. So right now, with all the projections that Audrey had presented, we didn't hear about how has this moved the percent primary care spend for the state, and is that where we want to be, and should we keep that in mind now or wait till a later time?
I think that's a great question. It may be more of a complicated question than right now, but I think this is a very well-informed advisory council, and I think everyone understands that there's been large amount of movement around the country to look at what primary care spend is. It's averaging around 4.5% or 5% of the total healthcare spend in our country. In Maryland, it's pretty typical for that. Other states have targeted increases. Rhode Island to 12%, others to 10% over time as an incremental increase, as they increase primary care spend, also restraining other spending, hospital and other spending, so that the total doesn't grow proportionately large. So a proportionate increase in primary care while restraining other spending has been, I think, noted in at least 5 or 6 other states. So what our proportion of spend would be for primary care is both dependent on what is in this model, what payments are made, and also the how pervasive the model is. So if we only had 10 practices and we increased them double their payments, it wouldn't have any effect on the overall primary care spend for the state. If we have 500 practices or 2/3 of the practices in the state and we increase it by 2%, it will have a 1% increase effect across the overall primary care spend. So it's both of those factors. It's what we increase, how much we pay within the program, and how broad the program is. I would probably put a little editorial note in here that the total cost of care model contract has called upon us to broadly transform the way we deliver health care in the state and move to population-based payments. It would be unsuccessful if we did that with a small number of practices. If we had many that were in fee-for-service and a small number that were in population-based payments. So directionally, and at least by the highest level of interpretation of the contract, by moving more to population-based payments and by moving more practices to that, we are in fact moving in a direction that was intended.
Okay.
Thank you.
A little rambling, but I hope it makes sense.
Thank you. It does.
Dr. Pham.
So Howard, to your question about what the balance of the PCF versus the flat fee should be, I think I remember prior policy discussions where we talked about one of the goals being to neutralize the incentive for the provider to deliver the marginal next E&M service unless the patient needed it, which would imply to me that, based on kind of, it's not a lot of literature, but there's some behavioral economics literature to suggest that you would then want the PCF to be at least 50% of their revenue, and maybe a little bit higher, but not to an extreme of, say, 80 or 90%, because then you may have providers who are not motivated to actually offer a visit when a patient needs it. But I defer to others. I think Bob knows that literature very well.
So that's a very interesting point, Dr. Pham, and we will come to that if Dr. Berenson wants to think about that for a few minutes in the next section where we'll talk on policy. And Dr. Riedman, with your sort of blessing, I would propose that on the first item for discussion, where it's confirmed use of the beneficiary, where money follows the person versus the practice, that we seemingly have a good sense that money follows the person, and ask for general consensus, or if there's disagreement to the contrary, we talk about to the contrary as opposed to money follows the person, which it seems that this group has indicated in the past that's what it should be. So anyone, Dr. Riedman, is that approach reasonable?
Sure, sure.
Okay. So does anyone feel that using a policy where the money follows the person is not appropriate as a matter of policy? Kevin?
Kevin, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I got it. The only, just to play devil's advocate here for a moment, we've talked a number of times about the issue of administrative burden on the practices. And the only concern I have about the money follows the person approach is, will this sort of stimulate a lot of activity around just documenting the problems that the beneficiaries have, with a goal of, I hate to say goal, but contributing toward higher levels of HCC scores. We've seen this kind of a problem with Medicare Advantage. And whereas if you go with the practice group, is that the other alternative to this kind of approach to things, it kind of dilutes the incentive to chase after all of those diagnosis codes that in turn lead to higher HCC scores. So that's the only caution I would urge about money follows the person.
So Gene, do you want to weigh in on that?
No, actually, and I don't disagree with what Kevin just said. I had another question on this one, and I don't have a problem with the principle. I think kind of like what Kevin said, but the other question I had is, how does that interact with some of the other things we're doing? You know, for example, the HSCRC is about ready to subsidize Medicare Advantage. So does that mean, you know, how are we going to account for those things? Are we going to suddenly have patients, more patients going into that, and then halfway through when they switch to Medicare Advantage for some reason, or during enrollment, are we going to lose patients, or how does that work as you're going from one to the other? And I don't know. I just think we want to think through this, that we don't create economic incentives that don't help the program. The last thing we need is people aggressively doing AWVs on their non-patients to capture patients for the program, or a situation where people are, you know, trying to block folks from going into Medicare Advantage because they don't want to lose the patient. So I just, have we kind of done some thought about all the other programs and how they interact and what that means?
Interesting question. Dr. Haff, and maybe Audrey can weigh in there here too. She has some research. Dr. Haff.
Why don't we ask Will to comment?
Will, are you available?
I am, yes.
Any comment here?
The comment is on how does this interact with Medicare Advantage? The question is, how does this interact with Medicare Advantage?
Correct.
I don't know. I think the commission or commissioners would like to see more enrollment in Medicare Advantage. I think to some extent that's orthogonal to what is going on in the fee-for-service system.
Okay.
Right. The problem is, though, Will, or the concern I have, and I think when I wrote my comments, and I'm not necessarily against Medicare Advantage. I don't think my doctors are. Some doctors participate with it as a practitioner and like it, you know, and some it can be another way that you can theoretically manage risk. But I'm just using that as an example where if we have the money follow the person, and then somebody ends up switching partway through the practice year, at the end of the practice year, let's say during open enrollment in November, they switch over. Does that mean the doctor loses all their primary care bonus from January to November? And if we follow this money follows the person strictly, what does that mean? And have we thought about the unintended consequences? So, I mean, I understand what the commission's trying to do, and it kind of makes sense to me. But we got to think about how they all interact and what that means, and we got to treat everybody fairly.
So,
yeah,
Gene,
that's a good point, Howard.
Yeah, so Gene, I think it's probably I think there's two different aspects to this. The reason for the money follows the person selection was that in primary care first they use HCC score averages for practices rather than doing it on an individual beneficiary level. And when we looked at by recollection, when we looked at what that would do to the MDPCP, virtually almost all of our practices would be in group 1, which is the lowest group and lowest payment, and a few more would be in group 2. None would be in the higher per beneficiary per month groups. So and from the modeling that we did, that was don't quote me on the exact numbers, but I think it was a 25% loss in revenue by using the primary care first average HCC scores. Money follows the person is simply saying that we're just doing, you're still using the HCC scores as per primary care first, but then allocating it on an individual basis by beneficiary and putting them into those four groups. So I don't think it would, we'd have to model again to see if it would have a negative effect if based on Medicare Advantage increasing in the state. But I think it would have probably the same effect, relatively the same effect, Medicare Advantage effect on either case. You'd still be losing a beneficiary. Perhaps a little less because none of the beneficiaries are valued as high in the average in the way that primary care first does it. They're all valued in a lower range.
And Audrey, can you summarize in a couple sentences the analysis that you did and the results of that when you looked at both money follows the patient versus the practice?
Sure. Dr. Haft actually got it quite right. So when we look at money follows the practice, each practice used the practice average HCC score. So across all of their beneficiaries, what is their average HCC score? And you put them in a bucket, put them in one of the PCF groups. So while in practice, a practice would have a mix of beneficiaries across various HCCs. If they're in group 1, they would receive $28 per beneficiary per month for every one of those beneficiaries. Under the money follows the person, it is a beneficiary with a high HCC score, a beneficiary with an HCC score of 3 or 4, would be placed into group 4, and there would be a higher per beneficiary per month payment for that specific beneficiary. So I think the impact of having beneficiaries transition into Medicare Advantage and out of the program is real on both sides. The practice would still be losing the per beneficiary per month payment for that beneficiary's departure. It would I think the biggest impact would be once you'd have to understand if there's any sort of selection bias there. Is it going to be your lower intensity beneficiaries that might be more likely to leave, or your higher intensity beneficiaries that might leave it to Medicare Advantage? Because it could have big swings in either model, the practice model or the beneficiary model.
Yeah, very good point. So perhaps we want to get a couple of our physicians to weigh in here. We've the thinking would have been up till this afternoon, a few minutes ago, that it is the general consensus unspoken that money follows the person. But I think we've had some counter views stressed, and maybe we need to think about this a bit more. Dr. Pham, any thoughts?
Yeah, my memory was that when Audrey at the last meeting showed the spread, the discordance between the actual scores and the actual payments, that they were quite dramatic. So it's not just that, practices in Maryland tend to end up in group 1, but there was quite the discrepancy between the payments that they would earn for high-risk patients. And so I just worry very much about a muddled economic signal being sent. So you may be discouraging them from focusing on coding behavior, but you're also signaling to them that they should care less about their high-risk bennies, because those high-risk bennies aren't going to earn them any more revenue. And that may not be the direction that we want to go in. I guess I would also point out that doing the money follows the practice does not actually eliminate the incentive to code more intensively.
Interesting.
Right. So it's not a solution for that concern.
See the point. Dr. Reed?
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Pham's comments that our group, and I'm sure a lot of other groups are doing this, but we're actually in the process of reviewing our compensation, our provider compensation formulas to look at population health and to incentivize our providers that are doing a good job of population health for exactly these reasons. So we're looking at it as a group payment, and then the groups can get that money, but there may be 4 or 5 providers out of 10 or 15 that are really taking care of those critically ill patients, and the compensation to them should be higher for taking care of those critically ill patients. I think that the premise that there are always going to be physicians that game the system and people that game the system and providers that game the system, but for the large percentage of primary care providers and physicians as a whole, we really care about our patients. That's why we do this, and no, we don't want to do coding, but we're really going to have the best interest of our patients in mind, and the idea that that everyone's going to game the system and try to put higher HCC scores and all. There's going to be that outlier that does that, but we're all looking to take care of our patients, and I think the money follows the patient or fairly compensates the providers that are doing the extra work on those more complex patients. And so that would be one of my arguments to go with that program. And I know it's not as straightforward, and nothing's ever as simple, and these are complex issues. But the use of the policy of using the beneficiaries seems to be the correct one for me. So if we need to, I'd like to make some decisions on this, but I think it's an interesting comment that been brought up by Gene and some others. So those are my thoughts. If others have other thoughts in the next 3 or 4 minutes, I'd like to hear them. Otherwise, I'd like everyone to maybe really seriously consider their pros and cons on this issue, so we can at least settle this at the early part of our next meeting. Kind of move on from that. I'd also like to kind of wrap things up. We've got about 5 minutes, and then we want to talk about further meetings. The last item on the performance-based adjustments. We're going to get into that next. Clearly, I'm not going to have time to do that. We need probably 20 minutes or so for Audrey to present that. So that'll be also the first part of our next meeting. So I'll open up for a couple of minutes before we wrap up about the money follows the patients. If anyone else has any other comments, then we'll go from there.
I think Melanie, comment.
Well, this is just, Gene has a comment in there at the bottom that I don't think we actually addressed. Gene, do you want to defer this to the next meeting? This is about how quickly practices are going to be forced into, are we going to force practices into track 3 and the timing of all that? I know that's not really kind of what we're talking about right now, but Gene's on the camera.
Yeah, I think Dr. Haft actually addressed that. I got the impression the answer was that 1 was going away, 2 was there, and then we don't really know the answer as to what the rule was for 3. That's my very bad summary of his longer answer earlier, but I think he addressed that. So the other question I have, though, I asked earlier, and Dr. Haft kind of answered it, is what is our plan to understand what this change in administration means? I think, we're getting signals, but obviously, we have a new president coming in, and that means we're going to have new direction, and I believe the new administration might have a greater desire to invest in primary care, and we might have different, all this work we're doing is great, but do we believe that do we need to kind of take a deep breath and find out what the goals are before we rush in with something and make sure we're still heading towards the same end of the race, or has the finish line changed?
Yeah, and that, thanks, Gene. I think Dr. Haft has said offline a bit, and even earlier in this call, that there's his anticipated thinking is that CMMI will put even more emphasis on primary care programs. Dr. Haft, can you just restate that, please?
Yeah, I think that the direction, in the current administration has been clearly toward primary care investment. Perhaps primary care first is a bit of a jog to the right, but every other indication has been toward emphasizing the importance of primary care. Even in the updated 2021 fee schedule emphasizes E&M and primary care visits. So I think that we'll see more of the same. Every indication from the people who we've talked to, and you will have your own networks also, who've been in the in transition teams and things, have said that's going to be the direction they're going to continue to go in. So I think we're in the right place, and I don't think we lose anything by saying what we're doing now. We're still working with this administration. They're great partners. They've gotten us here already, and the movement to population-based payments is I believe is spot on. Primary care investments are spot on. Being able to do appropriate performance assessments. I think all those things are still very much, don't demand, a sudden change. And I think this work that we're doing now is critical to getting to something that we can continue to push through to make continued change in Maryland. We don't want to be stuck in fee for service. We're largely stuck there now. So this is
I understand and I agree with everything you just said, Dr. Haft. My only point is we might have a little longer to get to the end of the race now, and we might not have to rush into a program that was developed by the administration that maybe a lot of us have some concerns about, and clearly America has concerns about. I think we have more people in the Maryland primary care program than they have enrolled in their national program across the whole country. And I believe those numbers are correct when I say that. So it just seems to me that we should be cautious about modeling our Track 3 too much after a program that seems to be not working. And maybe we can, come back with something that's a little different that might not have been as acceptable. That's all. Yeah. And maybe I should slow my roll a little bit too, but that's just my thought.
Well, Dean, I think that's exactly what we're doing here. Getting a better mousetrap.
So we're at about a minute left or so, and I'm interested in everybody's time. And I thought this was a great conversation tonight. So I said months and months ago that when I was asked, did I want to do this? I said no. I said, would it be fun? I said no. And would it have an impact? And I said, that's the answer. But I actually think this was a fun meeting. So thank y'all. I'd like to go ahead and just turn it over to Melanie for a quick second to give us update on our meeting schedule for the next couple of weeks, holidays and all.
Okay, so we are planning to have a meeting next Tuesday in the same time slot. That's the 17th, so 5 to 6:30. At this time, we are not planning to do on the week of Thanksgiving, which is the 24th, and then we would be resuming in December, December 1st. So just a couple real high level. There are meeting summaries that are posted to the website. The video will be posted online. The materials are made available to the public as soon as we get them ready. So those are on the website as well, and the phone number. So I think that's all from me. David, I'm going to turn it back to you for final comments.
Sure, thank you. And as we always do, it's customary to invite our executive director, Ben Steffen, to make a few words.
My words are few tonight. Just thank you for our staff and the team from H Metrics, and I appreciate everyone's thoughtful contributions this evening. Look forward to seeing you shortly.
Okay, very good. Dr. Reedman, I will say goodbye to everyone, and unless you have anything else to say. And thank you, and have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you back here again next week this time. Take care, everyone.